somebody controls the narrative in the world. And someone has controlled the narrative in this country as well. It's inevitable, perhaps it's inevitable, that narratives get controlled, and there are people who bring in counter-narratives, and the counter-narratives compete for space. And if you're a sensible liberal society, then you accommodate everybody. And I think that that's what India has prided itself in. Of course, the competition between narratives, and there are many narratives, but let's say a couple of dominant narratives, the competition between them has become very intense and politicized, because that narrative doesn't stop at the narrative. It has consequences and implications which are of a political nature. Now, a narrative must always have a purpose, and that purpose is a social, political, intellectual purpose the narrative has. But when it becomes dominated by politics, and I use the word politics in the narrowest sense, politics is a good thing to do. People think politics is a bad thing to do. But if you make politics very narrow, which is often described as party politics, then, of course, you lose the value of the narrative. Now, we've had a global narrative, and I believe I have no compunction and I have no hesitation in saying that the global narrative is getting vastly influenced by what India feels and says today. And there are obviously wonderful articulations of it. We may not agree with all of it as a political party, as a group of people in this country, but the narrative is being heard across the world. Now, when will, if you like, a narrative of the past that gave us a particular picture, when will that picture transform and change will depend on how sustainable the new narrative is. The trouble is, and I'll end with this, the trouble is that that narrative that's gone abroad was a narrative that seemed to be based on consensus in the past, but it is not based on consensus today. There are essential differences in one's perception between large groups of people in this country, and that transmits itself abroad as well. So inevitably, if I go abroad and somebody is to ask me about specifics of an attitude that is traveling from India abroad, I can't just simply say I agree with it, because we have disagreements. And I think the big challenge for us is, how does the new narrative accommodate differences and differences of opinion? And that's important, because as a democracy, we must know how to deal with our differences.
Mr. Khurshid, is narrative a function of hard power, or is it a function of a soft power? Or is it completely correlates with the rising economy?
No, economy has a very important role to play. We think that we have many attributes of our civilization and our culture that play a role, and it's wonderful that they play a role. Americans play a role. The British have played a role. No sex, please, we are British, etc. That's played a role, and this Niraj Chaudhary will tell you. But the fact remains that economic power and military power are important dimensions of any narrative. But a narrative doesn't have to depend on them. Now, today we have a very important economic power presence. We have a growing military power presence. But I think that we should not be dependent only on them. We should reach out to what you might call soft narrative or soft power perceptions or projections, etc. But essentially, what do we do with, if we disagree intensely at home, what do we do with it abroad? Can we agree to disagree so that at least abroad we can agree on everything or seemingly agree on everything? Are big questions that the top leaders in this country, both in terms of intellect and in terms of political power, have to decide.